Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sisu Sisters podcast.
I'm Annukka, a LinkedIn coach.
And I'm Dorita, a business English coach.
Our podcast is all about succeeding, with themes like life stories and light bulb moments. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sisu Sisters podcast.
Today, our guest here in the studio, or remotely, as you can see, is Jim Drury, who is a journalist and an author.
Hello.
Hey, Jim, for people who are listening, can you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Okay, so I've been a journalist for almost 30 years, which makes me feel very old. And about 20 years ago, I wrote a number of books. Wrote 4 books about 20 years ago. Then realised I wasn't going to be able to make enough money to do it as a job. So I stayed in journalism, and at some point I'll go back to writing books. At the moment, I work as a news editor for CGTN, which stands for China Global Television Network, which is a Chinese television channel. I am a news editor for the digital team, so I choose stories which we're going to cover for a digital audience on various platforms. Like if it's video, it'll be for TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. We also have articles on our website, so I'm one of the news editors for them.
Brilliant. So, having been a journalist for that many years, and I know you also used to work for Reuters, as a former marketing person myself, I'd like to ask you a question that's always on the tip of the tongue for most marketing people. What makes a good story? What can we do to impress a journalist if we want to pitch with a good story?
Well, I have an interesting perspective because I've been on both sides of the fence here. Because after I left Reuters, which was in 2019, I spent 3 years in a public relations firm making corporate videos, and I was always actually surprised how. I was always surprised actually when I used to receive press releases when I was at Reuters how bad some of them were. I think the story would often be buried about halfway down the press release, and I've given a couple of talks where people have asked me what I thought, and I said if I received 30 press releases in the morning, I would, if I hadn't been engaged by the headline and the first paragraph, I wouldn't read on, and I would just immediately delete it. If I was engaged by the first paragraph, I would read the first 3 paragraphs. This is all instinctive, so it might not be 3, it might be 4, but mostly it would be if I hadn't been engaged by then I would just delete it. And then, once you got my attention, then I would actually read all the way through. So that was always key. The other thing was there's often a temptation to get the company name into the first sentence, and that can be off-putting because I was always, as a journalist, always very happy to take on a story that I'd received from a public relations company if it was of interest, and I wouldn't try and write the company out of it. But you don't want to be hammered over the head too much with how great the company is at the beginning. You actually want to know what the story is. I think most stories that interest people are ones that someone can relate to them. If you've got something that most people will relate to. So if it's something like, I don't know, a health story, everyone's going to be interested in a health story because it could happen to them or one of their colleagues. Of course, it's different for specialist media. So if you're writing for specialist media, one piece of advice that didn't get taken very well by the company I worked for was that because sometimes I would be asked to try and get a story that we were promoting to broadcasters, but I was told I had to send the press release that was coming from them, and I thought actually a lot of our press releases were very much written with experts in mind, and that's fine if you're going to a specialist media. But if you're going to a more general media, you should have a separate version, something that's less bespoke, something that's more general.
So too corporate.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. But also, if you're not writing if you're not writing for a specialist, if you're not trying to get a specialist audience, which you might be, if you're trying to get a general audience, then try and think of what will interest a general audience, and also make it. There's a kind of a rule in journalism if you're writing for non-specialist media, which is you write, and I've always tried to do this. You try and write for your grandmother, so something that your grandmother would understand.
That's a good one.
It's quite a good rule of thumb, actually. So you're trying to explain something in layman's terms, and not trying to make it things so that you actually have to understand the subject to understand the story, because then you're narrowing your reach. But as I say, it is different if you're writing for if you're from a blockchain company and you're writing in a blockchain for the blockchain media, you would write about something that was about the technology that's involved or what have you. Whereas, there's a good example I remember where there was a blockchain company that I knew, and they had what would have been a fantastic TV story, but they didn't want to focus on that. But I was like, that's the way you're going to get a TV story. And it was about this guy who was an American politician in the middle of the Midwest in the States, and he had a massive cattle ranch, and all of his financial dealings with this blockchain company. And I said, well, we need to go out and film this guy. It'd be amazing. And the answer was no. That's not what we want to promote. But that would have been a good way in.
Thank you for that. That's really, really good. So when you said about if something doesn't catch your eye, you would delete it, which actually Anukka has a background in recruiting, sounds very much like when people look at CVs. So I had to just put that in there. But what does catch your eye?
Well, anything that's something that's I like solutions-based journalism. Solutions-based. So if something where it's a product a product that's actually going to improve people's lives markedly, and not just people who are interested in that particular field. That's always useful. So environmental stories are always, manna to heaven for journalists at the moment. So something that's got a person front and centre is always nice. Stories that have people in them are good. It's good to get first-hand examples of people and their involvement. That's always good. Anything that's sort of interesting technologically is good. There's no kind of hard and fast rule, but I suppose I'm slightly biased because I used to be the tech and science chief reporter for Reuters TV, so that was the kind of thing that was sent to me. I don't actually get that many press releases now.
No, but it's interesting to hear that, and again, with me and Anukka being active on LinkedIn, there's so many parallels to what works on LinkedIn on social media, and the person behind the story and a solution to a problem, and that. So it's good to hear that what works in journalism, and so we don't actually have to take a step too far from what we're sort of used to doing already. if you're active on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Brilliant. So we got to address the elephant in the room. Well, not the elephant in the room, because you mentioned them already. And I have got some of your books here. You've written a book about the Stranglers.
Yes.
You've written a book about Squeeze. One about Ian Dury and the Blockheads. And I'm surprised this is in our bookshelf, being West Ham family, but about the Chelsea legend Roy Wonder. So, how did you even think about writing these books? And we're going back to the same theme again. How did you decide on the subject, the story? What made you write these books?
Well, it's interesting that the actually came about by complete accident, which some of the biggest changes in my career have come by accident, and the things that I've chased haven't happened. So it was when I was at Reuters for 20 odd years. So in my early days there, I'd heard someone in passing said, "Oh, they're looking for someone to interview the Stranglers tomorrow night. You like the Stranglers, don't you?" And I was absolutely obsessive of the Stranglers. I said, "Oh, I'll do it, of course." And I did this interview, TV interview, and then a few months later, I went back to the person who was running the entertainment desk, and I said, "Could I interview Hugh Cornwell, who was the former lead singer of the Stranglers?" And I did an interview with him, and then his manager phoned me a week later and said, "Would you be interested in writing a book? He wants to do a book with a journalist who knows a lot about him, and you clearly know a lot about him." It's funny because I was at the back of he played a gig at the end of the interview. I interviewed him at the 100 Club, and I was aware that his manager was looking at me a lot of the evening, and he was watching me because I knew all the words to the songs, and I was wondering what that was about. So he phoned me, and it was just such a huge thrill to do that book. So then I asked the publishers if I could do similar books with other artists, and they came up with Ian Drury, which was a great choice. Similar name, but not quite. Yes, no relation. Yeah.
No. And I think most Finnish people will know Ian Dury and the Blockheads from like Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll.
Yes. Good. That's good to know he reached Finland.
Yes, he did.
And then the Squeeze one came about, and I would have done more I would have carried on doing that series. It was a series of books that were called Song by Song, and it was going through the band's careers through each song. That was the way into telling the story. And then the publishers went bankrupt, which was in early 2005 or 2006. They went bankrupt, so that ended. And I'd already started. I had the idea of kind of diversifying, so I did the football book because someone knew Roy, and then from then on, I tried to move into writing books that were. Well, it was less biography. I was writing books on entire themes. I researched a book on the history of football songs, and it was at a time. It was at a time with the publishing industry where commissioning editors were not able to just say yes to projects. They had to go through their sort of the board and the commercial arm, and things were getting turned down at that stage, and I got really fed up with it. So I was getting married, and I wanted to have a full-time job, so that's why it stopped. But yeah, I got into it completely by accident, but I loved it.
Yeah. So when you decided on these books, or they decided on you, one of my fears would be, if I was writing a book, that I'm halfway through the book and I'm like, oh, there's not enough material. So you must have done a lot of research to make sure that there was enough material for you to I guess songs, you would have known the band's songs, that there was enough of a sort of catalogue, but
That's true. It did feel the Ian Dury one was going to be a big task because I knew less about that, and it was a very tight deadline. They gave me a very tight deadline, and I was slightly worried about that because I was given 3 months to research and write it, and I had to. And there were a number of people. I had to interview sort of 15 people or so. So the only time I was ever slightly worried was when there was about 5 weeks to go to the deadline, and I had started writing it, and I wrote it in 5 weeks. And I kind of like deadlines like that. I'd never felt, once I'd started, I knew I was going to be all right. It was just the starting that was the problem.
yeah. And a silly question, have you ever got starstruck when you were interviewing all these people?
No, I didn't get starstruck. The one thing I remember was when I was doing the Stranglers book. So I was with Hugh Cornwall. The interviews would always be around his house. So I'd go around to his house, and we'd listen to the songs, and then we'd talk about them. And there was one section where he wanted to explain a point, and he picked up a guitar and started playing a riff to what was one of my favourite songs. And I remember thinking, this is amazing. How am I? But I tried to pretend it didn't really mean anything. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But actually inside I was, oh my goodness, this is my favourite songwriter ever. And he's explaining with his guitar how he wrote this song. That was the only time I came close to it, I think.
Yeah, because they do say don't meet your heroes as well, don't they?
They do, yeah. But I've been lucky generally. I think everyone I've dealt with has been really nice.
Going back to being a journalist, but also tying in with being an author, has there ever been a temptation to improve on a story?
When you say improve on a story, are you?
Well, because I'm a marketing person, I am quite often tempted thinking, oh, this would be better if I could just change that or do that. Obviously, I can use poetic license a little bit in marketing, but has there ever been a situation where you sat there and thought, oh, I wish I could add this to it?
I might be tempted, but I would like to think I haven't done it. It's very much against the journalistic code, but you can certainly select things that are beneficial to the angle you have. That's sort of inevitable that you would. And if there's something that someone said and you think, well, I could find other examples of that and beef that section up without embellishing it yourself, you're using other sources. So that would be about the nearest. It was different. It was very interesting when I went into PR because it was completely different, and for a very good reason.
So Annika, you had an interesting question you were talking about before we went on air with me. Okay, now I have to speak, and I haven't spoken English in a while, so please forgive me for my pronunciation now. I will edit this out, though.
You're fine.
Has there ever been a pressure from a publisher or editor to make changes you disagree with?
That's a great question. Certainly not with the books. That never happened. Actually, I was quite surprised how little got changed or was suggested for changing. Definitely, if you're a journalist and someone is sub-editing your work, you're never entirely happy with what someone's done, but you accept the process of it. I don't think there must be times where I've had things removed, but I can't. But they're not significant enough for me to remember. But there would be times, or there certainly have been times when I've been in positions where I've been told a topic shouldn't be covered, and that can be difficult. But again, you accept who you're working for.
For the listener, what would you like them to take away from this podcast, from your experience and that? Are there any tips or hints, any do's or don'ts that you sort of would like to share? You already did say at the top of the program about catching your attention by not being maybe too sort of corporate-y companies like, but anything else that you'd like people to take away and think, oh, that was a good tip?
Well, another one would be, I alluded to it early on, would be to try, if you're working, if you're trying to get the interest of a journalist who's in a newsroom who's not a specialist, definitely try and simplify your story. So, because I've received things I have no idea what I'm reading, and that's very hard to. That will definitely be a situation where it goes in the bin for me if it's something I don't understand. So, because there's a temptation whenever you're writing to show how much you know about something, and sometimes that's less is more. So sometimes I remember having someone calling me and telling me I'd made a mistake in turning down this story, and this really irritated me because I thought, well, I've done it for a reason, and I don't actually have to explain myself. And it meant that the next time they messaged me, I don't think I even read it probably. But see, don't berate a journalist and tell them they've made a mistake by not covering it.
But would you have reacted differently if they would have called you to ask you what can they do better next time for you to feature their story?
Yes, that would be much less. Yeah, no confrontation. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd definitely go along with that. That would be useful. Yeah.
Yeah. But no,
And
don't
also to
berate the
ask what
journalist.
kind of things would you be interested in as well? But it depends who you're working for. But if you're covering a wide variety of companies, would you could always have a sort of a supplementary call. We have this and this. What do you think of?
Yeah,
I mean,
if you're like a PR agency or somebody and you have clients from different fields.
the one thing I found really hard when I went into PR was dealing with journalists. I was surprised how rude a lot of journalists are. Yeah, I was really because I think I try and be nice, and I would only be dismissive if someone had been what I would describe as aggressively promoting something. But I was really surprised how dismissive a lot of journalists were, and I thought quite disrespectful. And I didn't like that element, I've got to say, because I was used to being in control.
So, thank you. Those were great tips. What's happening next in your life? What are you up to now? So, not writing any books?
No, although there was talk about rewriting one of doing well, not rewriting, updating one of the books that I'd done, but that hasn't come to anything yet. Other than working here, well, I'm probably going to bring back. I had a music podcast which I started in the first lockdown,
Oh, brilliant.
interviewing various musicians, mostly people that I knew, but sometimes people that I didn't know who I'd approached, and that was really fun. And I probably am going to go back and do a second series of that, because where I work now, I'm doing less original journalism because I'm basically the news editor, so I'm dealing with other people's journalism. Yeah, and I write some things. I wrote a story this morning, but it wasn't what I would call original journalism. It was basically writing up various wire copies of what was happening in Lebanon. So I'd like to go back to. I like interviewing people. I always thought I was good at interviewing people, and I get things out of them. So I would like to bring back the podcast.
And what's it called?
It's called a fistful of chords.
We'll make sure that we'll put that in the description of this episode so that people can find it and go and listen.
Yeah, it's still on there. It's still on Spotify, and it's still on Apple Podcasts and various others.
Anukka, any further questions? This sounds like he's on trial. Any further questions, my honor?
Actually, no.
Good.
No.
Well, all I'm going to say then is thank you ever so much, Jim, for
Thank you.
coming onto our podcast and sharing some of your wisdom and experience with us and with our listeners. Much appreciated.
I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, he was a brilliant guest, wasn't he? Yes.
Definitely.
I wrote down 3 takeaways from this podcast, and he said that don't hide the story within too much copy.
Mm-hmm.
Then he said simplify your message. That's a good one. And then don't confront the journalist if your story isn't featured. That's a good one as well.
Absolutely brilliant tips and hints. But that's all we got time for today. So it's an over and out from me here in England. Bye.
And it's Moikka from Finland. Bye.